tropical rainforests, grasslands and deserts, temperate and boreal forests, scrub and tundra. The view of this incredible diversity of biomes has been in this series so far more or less confined to lowland regions. But what happens when you take these biomes and climb upwards into thinner, colder air? Plants must adapt to the colder conditions, and in rising altitude, the biomes shift in an echo of increasing latitude. Set against dramatic mountains and plateau, plant life leaves its mark, creating living landscapes which are arguably the most stunning on our planet in the highlands of Earth. If you look at a map of the elevation of Earth's topography, you'll find a good proportion of the land surface is significantly above sea level. And so in a series on biomes, it would be a grave omission to not spend some time looking at how ecosystems have evolved to cope with altitude across these diverse regions of our planet. Due to various effects relating to heat transfer, the troposphere, which is the lower portion of Earth's atmosphere, cools as altitude rises. In dry air, this effect results in about 10 degrees Celsius of cooling per kilometer. As the troposphere extends up to about 12 kilometers above sea level, and since the highest point of Mount Everest is some 3 kilometers below this point, this cooling effect applies to all land surfaces on the planet. How this temperature drop affects plant life that sits upon the higher elevations of Earth is determined by the initial temperature at sea level, and this, of course, is determined by latitude, with the hottest areas in the tropics and in the subtropical deserts, and the coldest sea level temperatures being at the poles. But regardless of the starting latitude, the result of increasing altitude is usually to push the biome poleward in effective latitude. For example, a temperate forest at sea level will shift toward taiga in nearby mountains, and again to alpine tundra and eventually to a glacial ice cap if the mountains are high enough, all at the same latitude. Let's return to our Holdridge Life Zones chart. At last, we can look at the right-hand side of the diagram, the altitudinal belts that closely mimic the latitudinal regions. So, we find a general relationship between increasing altitude and latitude in terms of effective biome. A second concept to notice is that the type of altitude biome we will get will be determined by rainfall. As we increase in altitude and the temperature cools, for the same amount of rain there will be less evapotranspiration, allowing a higher biomass to accumulate. This explains why you often find forests upon the slopes of hills and mountains in drier regions, while the plains below are grassland or scrub. The chart doesn't describe what types of forest we'll find, however, and I'll discuss that detail a bit later. As always when it comes to biomes, simple changes in atmospheric effects and climate can lead to complex changes in ecosystems. In order to break this down, let's take a journey from the poles of our planet to the equator and examine the effects of altitude in each zone of latitude. Starting at the poles, we have, at sea level, the ice biome. The North and South poles are covered in ice, but while the ice at the North Pole, sitting on the surface of the Arctic Ocean, is close to sea level, the ice across most of Antarctica is at several kilometers in altitude due to the accumulation of snow over thousands of years into the great ice sheets that cover this continent. And this gives us our answer as to what happens to the ice biome with increasing altitude. No surprises, it's just more ice. Well, actually a bit less, as there is less snowfall in these much colder areas than can be found at sea level. But this doesn't affect the overall picture of a lifeless world in these areas. Moving into sea level tundra areas, and these are most widely found in the Arctic. If we increase altitude here, we quickly reach freezing temperatures where no plant life is possible, and accumulations of snow produce glaciation as portions of the ice biome. The most marked example of this is in Greenland, which lies at a similar latitude to Arctic tundra, evidenced by the fact that the coasts are all in that biome. But the world's largest island is mostly covered in ice due to the accumulation of millennia of snow upon its ice sheet. This is likely a hangover of a past ice age, with temperatures upon the top of the sheet remaining below freezing and preventing melting. As we move into the sea-level boreal forest or taiga, we find that this vast dark green ocean of conifers is peppered with higher altitude sections that are turned into tundra. Here is the first time we see the tree line, a horizontal line that can be seen on mountains where trees give way to low-lying vegetation such as grasses, dwarf shrubs, heather, sedges, moss, and lichen. Trees cannot grow if the summer temperatures do not rise above 10 Celsius, and so this tree line is where we find this subdivision of average summer temperature. Rising beyond the alpine tundra, we again reach glaciers and the ice biome if the mountains are high enough. Continuing toward the equator, we reach the temperate and subtropical zones where things get a little bit more complex, because at these latitudes we can find temperate forest, grassland, scrub, or desert depending upon prevailing levels of rainfall and other factors. Our Holdridge Life Zones chart navigates us through this complexity. Simplest is the case of the temperate forests. As we increase altitude here, broadleaf forests of beech, oak, and maple give way to hardier broadleafs such as birch and aspen, but more commonly conifers such as spruce, fir, pine, and larch. Eventually, only conifers remain in a form of alpine taiga, which eventually gives way to alpine tundra and ice if high enough. Now, the tree line here is often lower in altitude than the 10 degrees Celsius summer temperature average earlier mentioned, as high winds at these higher elevations often prevent the development of trees. An example of this are the heather-covered uplands of Great Britain that were deforested millennia ago and have never recovered despite being unused for agriculture due to constant high winds that blow across these regions for most of the year. Trees on the border of alpine tree-line zones tend to have twisted trunks and stunted growth when exposed to constant freezing winds, and this type of landscape is called krummholz. In the case of grassland and scrub at sea level, as earlier mentioned, slopes of hills and mountains in these regions tend to be tree-covered as evapotranspiration falls with reducing temperature. These montane forests are composed of mixed broadleaf and conifer species such as ponderosa pine, juniper, and evergreen oak. Above the tree line, these forests yield once again to a form of alpine tundra, although this is usually very sparse due to the comparatively low precipitation, and if high enough, glaciers will be found on mountaintops. The largest of the temperate latitude alpine tundra areas are the vast and barren steppes of the Tibetan Plateau, with this region having an average altitude of 4.5 kilometers. Sea-level deserts offer the only departure from the general pattern of alpine slopes having forests. Semi-desert, like grassland and scrub, gives way to forest at higher elevations, but particularly dry deserts such as those of the Atacama in Chile are so devoid of moisture that no forests occur, or even tundra for that matter, with just a thin dusting of snow at the highest peaks of these areas, which are accumulations of occasional precipitation that has remained frozen for centuries, if not millennia. But it's upon our arrival in the tropics where the most interesting effects of altitude upon biomes occur. The fundamental reason for this is the lack of seasonal temperature changes. In temperate regions, changes in seasonal temperature yield frosts in the mountains as well as at sea level, and so we tend to find similar types of trees and shrubs in both. But in the tropics, one can rise in altitude into a temperate climate that, unlike the climates of the temperate latitudes, has little seasonal temperature change, and importantly, no frost, which can dramatically affect the type of plants that grow here. Such is the uniqueness of this climate zone that I devoted a whole video to it in my Secrets of World Climate series and briefly spoke of the unique plant life that can be found in such regions. In the tropics, we find at sea level tropical rainforest, tropical seasonal or dry forest, or savanna depending upon the amount and annual distribution of rainfall. At higher elevations in all of these cases, we'll find some kind of specialized forest composed of various broadleaf tree species as well as palms. In the case of savanna, less evapotranspiration due to cooler temperatures increases the covering of trees, while the tropical forests morph in terms of the type of species present. What species occur depends upon the continent, but like their sea level companions, fall into three broad groups of neotropical in Central and South America, African, and Malaysian in Southeast Asia. Tropical rainforest often gives way to cloud forests, which in addition to regular rainfall, receive water in the form of fog drip. The broadleaf trees in these forests are usually not as tall as their sea level counterparts, but often have thicker and more gnarled trunks. They are also referred to as mossy forests owing to the moss that covers practically every surface, owing to the saturated water passing through the forest in the form of fog. In Colombia, we find the world's tallest palms, the wax palms of Cocora, that rise up to 60 meters in height. In fact, this country, due to its large areas of subtropical highland climate, is believed to have more species of palms than any other. Above the tree line, however, things become even more unusual as we enter a subtropical grassland, moorland or heathland depending upon the region. For in these tropical regions, the altitude, where the temperature drops below 10 Celsius that prevents tree growth, is very high. This results in two effects. The first being much thinner air than in comparable alpine tundra, the second being very high day-night temperature variation. And as mentioned, there are no seasons in regard to temperature. So plants here are uniquely adapted and frankly don't look like the plants found anywhere in the world. An example of these almost alien-like landscapes can be found on the slopes of Mount Kenya in East Africa. A more normal form is the Puna grassland that is found in the most extensive of these subtropical highland areas, which occurs on the vast raised Andean altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, as well as adjoining highland areas in Ecuador, Argentina and Chile. In conclusion of this episode, and of all the land biomes covered in this series, it is perhaps fitting to look at Africa's mightiest and most famous peak, the giant Mount Kilimanjaro. This dormant volcano rises to almost 6 kilometers above sea level and almost 5 kilometers above its base on the East African plateau. In those 5 vertical kilometers, we go from savanna grassland, which is now largely farmed, through tropical, then temperate montane forests, moorland like that just described on Mount Kenya, and then an almost desert-like tundra zone before reaching the glaciers on its summit. Very few places in the world allow someone to experience almost the full gamut of our planet's biomes in such a short trip. Kilimanjaro, then, is really like our planet in miniature: diverse, fascinating, awe-inspiring, and majestic. And that's the Highlands. I hope you enjoyed this overview of the biomes of the high places of our world. If you did, then please hit the like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd especially love to hear from you if you live up in one of these regions. Don't forget to check out the website. I have provided a link in the description to this particular video with the full transcript and high-resolution maps available. If you haven't already done so, then please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where at last we leave behind the land and head out onto the seas.